final public meeting for the Erie to Pittsburgh Trail Gaps Alternative Routes Study. So today we are going to be presenting the final concepts for this project for the various areas. But before we dive into the meat and potatoes of this meeting, I'm going to provide some quick housekeeping updates. So we would love for this to be an interactive meeting. We strongly encourage folks to ask questions, provide comments, right? But if you're not actively providing a comment or asking a question or helping with the presentation, we're going to ask that you remain muted to minimize any background noise. And then if you do have a question, please feel free to unmute yourself and just say out loud, you know, I have a question or I have a comment, or feel free to type it into the chat box. That's another way that you can submit those questions or comments. We will have somebody monitoring that during the meeting, so it will not be overlooked. We will make sure that it gets incorporated in. All right, so with that, I will first provide a quick project summary for this project. So the Northwest Commission has funded this study to ultimately determine the safest optimal on-road or connection routes for bicyclists around the existing gaps along the Erie to Pittsburgh Trail. Ultimately, the results of this study are going to be used to communicate route conditions to trail users and cyclists, and then allow for trail groups, counties, municipalities, others to pursue grant funding and ultimately assistance in completing those improvements. So the 3 gap areas that we are looking at are shown on the screen there in the little graphic over here. We are looking at the Hightowne Borough to City of Titusville gap. We are looking at the Emlenton to Foxborough gap down here, as well as we're calling Parker to Armstrong Trailhead, or the Allegheny River Trailhead to the Armstrong Trailhead gap. So those are the 3 areas that we're going to be looking at, and once again, sort of evaluating what the on-road options are, and then coming up with that. So for the meeting today, as I noted, we are going to be sharing those final concepts for the project, and sort of hearing your questions or thoughts you might have on those final concepts. So we'll talk through those reports that we've put together for each of those sections, talk through the concepts, and then sort of open it up for your questions. And then after we're done walking through the 3 reports, I will then circle back and we'll talk about next steps for the project so that everybody has line of sight of what that will be. So with that, we are going to start actually with the Emlenton to Foxborough section. So for this project, or excuse me, for each of the projects, I'm going to walk through a high-level summary of each of the reports so that you know what's included in those reports, what information and resources are going to be available to you once everything is finalized and out and available, right, for the public. And then I will walk through in more detail the actual concepts themselves, the final concepts together. So with that, Emlenton to Foxborough. The report starts with an introduction of the project, some background information, some maps to help locate people to the area that we're talking about. Then it moves into a summary of the data collection that was done, right? The engagement process of the stakeholder team, the public involvement pieces that were involved in the project. And then it dives into the existing conditions. This includes sort of the regional context, the land use context in the area, the trail context itself, right? The specific pieces for the trails in the area, as well as key destination areas in both Emlenton Borough and Foxborough Borough. And then it also lays out the roadway context for the roadways in that gap area. So for each of those, it has a little description and some pictures of the roadways to really document those existing conditions. There's also a description of the bridge context in this area, as well as the general environmental context for potential environmental concerns in the area. And then also it lays out the property boundaries. We've got some graphics, screenshots from the property, online property boundaries. We also provide a summary of some of the sort of safety data and observations based on what's publicly available for the PennDOT reportable crash data. And then, as noted, we then dive into the conceptual alternative. So for this part of the report, I'm going to talk in a little more detail. So for this Emlenton to Foxborough gap, there are two primary on-road options based on the roadways that are out there. You can either go on the eastern side of the Allegheny River, or you can go on the western side of the Allegheny River. See in the graphics that are shown on the screen here, those two concepts on the eastern side and the western side are listed as not recommended. I'll get into that a little bit once we start walking through the specifics, which is why we've then also come up with concept C, which is an off-road option. Let me walk through why we've listed it that way. So for concept A, which travels along the eastern side of the Allegheny River, would travel along Main Street, so SR 208, up to Metz Road, and then down SR 58. So this route is really rolling hills, rural scenery, right? However, the roads within that section, particularly SR 208, has higher speeds, so 55 miles per hour, and a limited roadway width. So based on those conditions, in our expert opinion, we believe it is not safe, would not recommend that option without widening the roadway in some way, which in this case, it would be extremely expensive based on the terrain in this area, right? So that is the reason that this route is not recommended. You see in the pictures, it's very constrained. We've got the hills, guide rail, right, big drops, not recommended. The other route option, that graphic needs to be updated, apologize. We'll get that cleared up. Second route option travels along the western side of the Allegheny River and travels along this roadway here and then up to Foxborough. So on that portion, pictures here of SR 268, once again, higher speeds, limited roadway width, with sort of constrained conditions, not recommended for on-road facilities. So those are the two on-road options, which as noted are not recommended, hence why we have come up with concept C, which is that the trail groups, municipalities, counties, right, should continue to pursue that off-road route option. Got some pictures here of sort of the route it would go, which basically just follows along the river. For this particular one, we've identified sort of a high-level planning level cost estimate, so conceptual level cost estimate of what it might look like to do that, as well as some implementation steps. So as you can probably imagine, this area, and this is what we heard from the stakeholder team as well, there are some, let's say, property negotiations issues of whether the abandoned rail bed has been reverted back to the existing property owners. That is the critical path for implementing that off-road option, is resolving those property negotiation issues. But the recommendation based on the on-road facilities on the other two options is to continue with that and to make that the priority, is to push through those implementations. Any questions related to the Emlenton to Foxborough concepts that were presented? A question? All right. So for this report and for the other reports as well that we're going to be walking through, our team does not identify a recommended option except for this one, which is noted that the off-road is the recommended because of the other two. But for the future ones, you'll see there is no final recommendation. We'll go ahead and jump to the next one if there's no questions. So for the Parker to Armstrong Trailhead, for this section, I will once again walk through the report and then talk in detail around the concepts that we developed there. So you will note that the layout of the report is very similar to the others. We start with an introduction, some background information, the location information, We summarize the data collection that was done, stakeholder team involvement, public involvement, and then we dive into the existing conditions. Regional context, land use context, trail context would be very similar, right? The roadway context for the area, pictures of all the roads out there. Include the bridge context that this is over the trailhead. Environmental context, property line, safety data and observations, and then we dive into the conceptual alternative. All right, so for this Parker or Allegheny River Trailhead to Armstrong Trailhead section, it essentially is looking to connect the Allegheny River Trailhead to the Armstrong Trailhead down here. We have come up with two on/off-road concepts for this. The first one is traveling along the river here, along River Drive. There is a portion of the property for this railroad that is now a roadway that is at least listed on the online property parcel identifier to be owned by the Allegheny River Trails of Clarion County. So a portion of it is sort of taken care of. However, from about here all the way down to here, there's an abandoned railroad bed. And once again, the property negotiation, property rights have not yet been finalized or determined what that is, whether it's been reverted back to property owners. And then there's a portion here leading in from the end of that abandoned rail line that would pass through private property owners. So obviously there would be some property negotiations for that. And then it would jump back onto the roadway segment, so Monterey Road. As you can imagine, this particular concept would provide sort of the, apologies, pictures here, would provide an along the river route that would go through that area. The other concept.
Jennifer,
yes.
Jennifer, this is Kim Harris. And just before we get too far and I forget, the property, the section that's owned, it's owned by the Allegheny Valley Trails Association, not the Allegheny River Trails in Clarion County.
Okay. Appreciate that, Kim. So the parcel viewer online must have the wrong thing.
Yeah, it should say Allegheny Valley Trails Association. I'm almost positive on that.
Okay. Appreciate that additional feedback. Yeah, I received some comments from, I think, Ron Steffi that it was Allegheny River Trails of Clarion County, so we might need to track that one down a little bit more. But
okay.
Yeah. But either way, it is a trail organization that owns that particular portion. So this route travels along the river, and as you can imagine, provides with that rural, lovely riverfront scenery, right? And would be a much more level terrain than the other option, which, apologies for the errors in concepts. Travis, I will make sure I get some updated copies to you, to the stakeholders. The other route travels up into the hills, up on the roadway. So this is the on-road concept. So it travels up along these windy roads, and then back down, and then up onto Monterey. As you can probably imagine, this one is a little less direct, a little more hilly, but for these on-road options, it wouldn't require additional right-of-way negotiations, which is a huge pro, right, for the implementation of this one. Plan would be to implement a shared roadway facility. So what would that mean? It would look like signs posted along this segment that would have share the road signage with bicyclists and the vehicle on there. So relatively inexpensive, quicker implementation, let's say, than the other option. So for each of those two concepts that we've put together, we've also included high-level cost estimates, as well as sort of general considerations, what would need to be part of that, and then the implementation steps for either of those. As I sort of alluded to when I first started in for this report, we don't come up with, or we don't provide a recommended option. We wanted to make sure and leave the flexibility for the trail groups, the counties, municipalities, right, to make the choice that makes the most sense based on their interests and strategic implementation, how they'd like to move that forward. But we wanted to include both concepts there so that options are available to them. Any questions about these two concepts for the Parker to Armstrong Trailhead?
Could I ask which Armstrong Trailhead you're speaking of?
The one on Hillville Road, so the end of that segment. Sort of like the furthest north that segment goes is where it would sort of connect in on Hillville Road.
Is there a trailhead there now?
My understanding is that it's unofficial trailhead, not in the same way. It doesn't have the same types of facilities that, like, for example, the Allegheny River Trailhead has with like the signage.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, Tony, I think Chris Ziegler, helped Jennifer with some of the information.
Mm-hmm. I was just curious where that trailhead was.
Yeah, so if you pull up the Erie to Pittsburgh Trail website, there is a mapping of sort of the furthest north that it goes. Our section ties into that furthest north segment. Good question. Thank you, Tony. Any others? All right. Then we'll walk through our last report here. So the final segment is the Hidetown to Titusville segment. Once again, I'll give a quick summary of the report and then I'll dig into the concept. So once again, starts with an introduction, location information. We go through the data collection, stakeholder team, public involvement, right? Dive into those existing conditions, the context, land use, trails, in the area, key destination areas in both Hidetown and Titusville, as well as the roadway context for the roads in that area. Lovely pictures, descriptions, right? And quite a few in this one. And then a couple bridges in the area. The environmental context of potential environmental concerns based on the concepts, right? And the property boundaries. And safety data and observation. All right. And then we dive into the conceptual alternative. So for this segment, we have two overarching conceptual routes to connect Titusville to Hidetown, Hidetown to Titusville. For each of those, there are two options for the segment on SR8, and I'll walk you through that. But from a high-level perspective, your patience, everyone. There we go. From a high-level perspective, the two routes are Concept 1, which is an on-road facility through the town of Titusville, along SR8, up to SR408, into Hidetown. The second concept is a combination of off-road and on-road facility. So this one would travel alongside the railroad line and then along the abandoned rail line, up to the road behind Walmart, hop up the road, and then be on SR8 for the rest of the way, and SR408 into town. So those are the two overarching concept routes. We do include a note in that ideally, based on what we heard from our stakeholder team, that the community would prefer an off-road route for the entire length of this trail connection, as it would be more comfortable, right, for those recreational trail users, families, etc. It was not included in the concept routes because there's been some historically expressed property owner issues for a portion of that segment. But in the future, these two on/on-off road concepts could serve as the supplemental road routes for the overall transportation network, right? If we're thinking about active transportation network, having multiple parallel routes can be really helpful and provide different access opportunities, right? Just want to make sure I note that. All right, so with that, I'm now going to dive into what those two concepts and the options that go with them actually are. On to the next. All right, so the first one, 1A, this is once again the on-road option. So it would travel as a shared road facility. So this would look like sharrows of little bicycles with arrow pavement markings on the roadway with shared roadway signage right up through town. This segment is already noted. The light blue turquoisey is already there based on the Queen City Trail signage that's there. We've also provided an alternate parallel route up along this roadway, Spruce Street, which would provide a, let's say, quieter roadway experience compared to the main street that is currently noted. Either way, both of those routes, once you come through town, would then transition along SR8, this first portion here, as a shoulder bike lane facility. Then once you hit this roadway here, it would then transition to a buffered bike lane up to SR408 and then turn into a sharrow facility. So once again, a shared roadway. So what are some graphics to go along with that? We've got, this is the shoulder bike lane segment, right? The lanes would be reduced to 10 feet. You'd have a delineation, the shoulder bike lanes would be on either side. And then the option for SR8 for this one, 1A, is a buffered bike lane. So what that means is there's a bike lane on the shoulder with a painted buffer between the vehicle lane and the bicycle lane. So that is 1A. For 1B, it is the same route. The only difference is what's being done along SR8. And the difference is, instead of being a buffered bike lane, it's a two-way separated bike lane on one side of the roadway. So instead of having a bike lane on each side of the roadway, you have two bike lanes traveling in those opposite directions, so two-way, right, on the southwestern side of SR8. So obviously this would involve shifting around of where the lanes are currently on the roadway, restriping pavement, as well as the addition of delineators, right? Those tubes that you can put out there to provide an additional buffer between the vehicles. For either of those options, as you can probably imagine, there will need to be thoughtful designs at the driveways and the intersections for the side roads, right, along this section. We don't provide specifics on those details for the designs, but we do say that these absolutely need to be a part of the design moving forward if these options are selected. All right, so that's 1A, 1B. We move along to concept 2A. You will see that it follows along the railroad and the abandoned rail line until we get to the road behind the Walmart. Then it transitions to a shared roadway facility up that little road up to SR8. And for 2A, we have the, once again, buffered bike lanes on SR8, and then a shared roadway into Hightown. So what would that look like? It would be a gravel trail, as noted, along that abandoned rail line area, and then buffered bike lanes on SR8. As you can probably imagine, where we're going with this, concept 2B is the same route for the first part, and then a two-way separated bike lane on SR8. So once again, similar concept of having two-way separated bike lanes on the southwestern side of the road. All right. So those are the four concepts that we put together for this project. Are there any questions related to those four concepts? No concept or no questions? So once again, very similar to the perfect Armstrong, we don't provide a recommended option. We simply say, here are four concepts, four options to choose from. to provide ultimately the greatest flexibility for those entities who are interested in moving this forward, right? All right. So with that, that is the conclusion of the summary of the 3 reports that we have for this project. I am now going to jump into sort of the next steps conversation. So what happens next with these reports? Once I get those figures updated that clearly have a quick error there, we'll get those updated, and then we will send those along to the Northwest Commission's Transportation Advisory Committee, the TAC, for them to review in advance of their June 28th meeting. Our team will be presenting the outcomes and the final concepts from these reports at that meeting. The hope is that then the reports are approved, right? Studies are approved. Once that is done, we will upload the final reports to the project website, and the various planning entities then have it for them to be able to carry it forward and to move forward with the next steps for implementation. Any questions around sort of the next steps for this project? Any other questions, comments, concerns for the greater good here on the call before we close the meeting for the day? All right, well, hearing none, thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to join us to learn a little bit more about the final concepts for this project. We really appreciate you joining us and asking your questions. As noted, we will be presenting this at the TAC meeting and providing information on the website, so please keep your eyes out for that. And with that, have a wonderful rest of your evening, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. I'll get those updated reports over to you ASAP.
Okay, sounds good.